Hello and thanks for joining us for the CGTN special coverage of the US midterm elections. I'm Anand Naidu.
And I'm Sean Cable. Voters are still casting ballots across the country, and of course there's a lot at stake. This election is going to determine which party controls the US Congress. Democrats currently have a majority in both chambers. All of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs. Republicans would need to pick up just 5 seats to win control of the House.
In the Senate, 35 of the 100 seats are at stake. Senate races are taking place in these states. Republicans would need to pick up just 1 seat to gain control of the Senate. Voters are also choosing who will lead individual states. These are governors' races on the ballot in 36 states. And there are a number of key issues driving people to the polls, from the economy to crime and abortion rights. And many believe democracy itself could be at stake in this midterm election.
Well, midterm elections are often viewed as a referendum on the performance of the sitting president. Joe Biden is halfway through his first term, and with 2 years left in office, the outcome of this election could determine the fate of Biden's legislative agenda.
Let's bring in CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King. Nathan, this election could shape the U.S. political landscape for years to come. So lay it out for us. What's at stake?
You're absolutely right. Great to have you, Anand and Sean, both of you veterans of midterm elections, where you know that essentially the incumbent president's party usually loses some seats in Congress. But with this wafer-thin margin, as you said, only 5 seats in the House, only 0 seats in the Senate, with Kamala Harris, the vice president, casting the tie vote there, it really will come down to the wire. We are looking at key races, and I can tell you the polls are going to be closing in Virginia, some parts of Indiana in the next hour. And if you look at the sort of very competitive races in the House of Representatives here behind me, of which there aren't many, we will get an indication very early on about whether there's going to be a Republican majority properly. Now, a wave election is usually about 40 seats, but the Republicans, as you said, only need 5 in the House. They should do it. And in the Senate, they only need 1. Now, where are we looking in the Senate? Pennsylvania, which was Republican, is now a toss-up state. There could be a Democratic pickup there, but they also are threatened with potentially losing a seat they gained in the presidential election in Georgia, and you've got to watch out for Arizona and Nevada as well. So all to play for, and I can tell you, if no one gets 50% in Georgia, you know this, Sean, everyone knows it, that if no one gets 50%, it goes to a runoff. So instead of just counting for a few hours, maybe a couple of days, we could be waiting weeks, if not over a month, before another election in Georgia to decide the fate. And of course, this all plays into Americans' electoral insecurity, whether it's worries about their democracy or worries about the process itself, fueled by Donald Trump, the former president's big lie that he essentially won the 2020 election. So you can feel the sort of angst as Americans go to the poll. What is quite incredible, as you said, is that people have been voting in quite large numbers. 45 million people voted before Election Day. Normally about 150 million Americans vote for president, about 100 million for midterm elections. We could see 120, 130 million. That shows participation. But this is not a bringing together of America. As you know, it's highly partisan, highly divided, with even some people running for local elections, governorships, that deny that Joe Biden won the election. So all this could be very, very messy, as we expect, if we, as we expect, get a very, very tight election night tonight. And I just want to add a foreign policy thing. If everyone thinks this is just domestic, yes, it's about abortion. Yes, it's about inflation. Yes, it's about education. Yes, it's about crime. But also on the books is going to be Republicans. If they take over Congress, they've promised not to sign blank checks to Ukraine. That could have huge geopolitical consequences. The Iran nuclear deal on a knife edge, Republicans will probably kill it. And of course, more legislation aimed at Beijing. So all the world should be watching this election.
Yeah, Nathan, let's dig a bit more into that, because another thing we've heard, if the House goes to the GOP, they would basically scrub the January 6th committee and then begin investigating Hunter Biden to a great degree. But let's get back to what's at stake, why people internationally should be watching us. I think that you've done a pretty good job at the White House of explaining what is at stake from an international perspective. But let's dig a bit deeper into China and Ukraine.
Well, thanks, Sean. I really appreciate the compliment. But it does have huge effects in terms of Congress controlling the purse strings. So they control where the money goes, whether it's for development of the Navy, for example, in the, as it's called, Indo-Pacific, by the US, where the arms go in terms of countries like Ukraine that the US is supporting. And there is a real feeling, and as you know, if you go back through the Trump presidency and understand, remember his impeachment for asking then newly President Zelensky to investigate the Biden family, this has deep connections with the American political system. And if you add that to the scrapping of the January 6th committee, which will try and rush out its report before the new Congress takes control in January if the Republicans win, is really making a connection between the stability of American democracy and also Ukraine as well. And you're right, when Republicans take control, if they do, of the House, they have subpoena power. And they won't just be subpoenaing, for example, domestic officials. They'll be subpoenaing people like the CIA. They'll be talking to the Defense Department. They'll be talking to other international agencies. So they will decide where the money goes, where the attention goes. And I can tell you, in the run-up to the presidential elections in the next 2 years, as you know, the US never stops campaigning ever for its elections. There will be more focus on China and the competitive or strategic competitive relationship, whatever they label it on. But I can tell you that will come more and more under the microscope going forward. So if you thought the CHIPS Act, if you thought the semiconductor controls that we've seen imposed, if you thought the rhetoric over TikTok was bad over the last few years, just wait until they get into an election season. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but any China watcher knows just how toxic the environment is here on Capitol Hill when it comes to the Washington-Beijing relationship.
Nathan, you're going to have a long night. We'll continue to check in throughout the evening here on CGTN. Ani?
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Well, let's bring in our guests right now who will join us throughout this hour. Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist, and Douglas Sloan is vice president of the NAACP's DC chapter and principal at National Capital Strategy Group. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Adolfo, let me start with you. If we look at the race for the House of Representatives, it's looking pretty good for the Republicans. I mean, all the polls are indicating that they will regain control of that House. But if we look at the United States Senate, well, that's a different story because all the polling showing us right now that it's neck and neck, and in many of those key races, it's a dead heat. So at this stage, what are your expectations?
Well, we'll see tonight. What time remains. In terms of the House, absolutely, Nathan's right. It's only a 5-seat pickup. And historically, as Nathan reported, absolutely, the president's the party in power usually loses seats. So it's a question of the margin. The question is whether this will be, it's important for the House, whether this will be a 20 or a 35-plus seat pickup. That's all that's in play here, really. It's mathematically impossible, really, for the Democrats to hold the House. They would have to win all the seats they're favored to win in, and then win 19 of the 20 toss-ups. So that's just not possible. However, the number is key, because if you have a large Republican wave, it will give Speaker to be Kevin McCarthy, a Republican leader, will become the next, an latitude to move an agenda. The smaller that number is, then he has to deal with factions, as did Nancy Pelosi with the more progressive elements of her party. So it becomes more difficult. That will be a key number to look for, is the margin. In terms of the Senate, of course, that the Republicans are defending 21 seats, which is 35 or up. So that's a disadvantage. It will probably be decided in, I think Nevada will be the key state, actually, if there's a Republican pickup in that state, which looks to be the most promising pickup at the moment. The Georgia race will likely go to a runoff. No, neither of those candidates have surpassed 50% in the polling. It could, one or the other, but probably that won't be decided. So Nevada will be the key. Pennsylvania is reported here, and Arizona are very close. The question is tonight whether there will be surprises on either side. The race is close in North Carolina. Republicans need to hold that Republican seat. And in Washington State, surprisingly strong Republican showing, as is in Colorado, for those Senate seats held by Democrats, and New Hampshire. All those are Democrat seats that, in a very, very big wave, could then push the Republicans to a 2 to 3 seat pickup. But at this point, I am predicting either a tied Senate or the Republicans by 1.
Douglas Sloan, great to have you with us. What are your thoughts on that? Mixed expectations for the Democrats. As I said, the polling is showing Republicans could take the House, but the Senate, of course, is too close right now. Where do you see it going?
Well, regarding the House, I'm inclined to agree with Adolfo on that. It looks like the Republicans are going to take the House back, as is par for the course of any midterm election with the opposing party in the White House. Regarding the Senate, I'm going to disagree with him a bit there. I think that the Dems will hold the Senate. I think that we will maintain control over all of the incumbent seats, including Nevada, New Hampshire, Colorado, where we have a big lead last time I checked, and gain the seat in Pennsylvania with the race of Fetterman over Oz. And I understand. Well, just looking at the polls, I'm just going with the polls that that have been put out showing, Fetterman over Oz by 5 points. I also have Warnock beating Walker in Georgia. That's another 3-point lead. New Hampshire, Hassan over Bolduc. That's another 4-point lead. Colorado, that's a 10-point lead with Bennett over O'Day. And so that's just dealing with the incumbents. And I say this because Republican pollsters, it's a very interesting phenomena that we've been looking at this cycle. Republican pollsters have been flooding the zone with a number of polls that have been showing a heavy rightwards lean towards their candidates, which seem to come in conflict with some of the history that we've seen in some of the numbers that we're getting back regarding voter registration of young voters with Gen Z, as well as heavy early voter turnout in those states, which tends to lead towards Democrats. So in terms of some of those polls that are showing Republicans with the lead, I think that we're going to be surprised tonight and tomorrow. I think that, like I said, I think that Dems will at least hold on to the Senate by 1 seat, but we may be surprised. We may be surprised in Ohio. The last time I checked that poll, Vance was leading by only 2 points, and we may be surprised in Wisconsin. But if I had to bet money on it, I would say that the Dems are going to hold the Senate by 1 seat, or rather hold the Senate and win by an additional seat, and that we're in all likelihood going to lose the House.
Well, may I comment on that quickly?
Yeah, very quickly, Adolfo, go ahead.
Yeah, Douglas is my friend. Spring hopes eternal. I hope we can come on the show a little later tonight when the returns are in.
Okay.
I'm using the Real Clear Politics average. Those numbers are not what the Real Clear Politics average show. The average.
Right.
There are Republican polls that show us winning in all of these states, and there are Democratic polls that show what Douglas is saying. I'm telling you what the average is for this program, which I take seriously. The average does not have, a 4-point lead for Fetterman or a 10-point for Bennett in Colorado. They just don't, Douglas.
Right.
They show them as dead heats.
And I understand everything that you're saying, Adolfo, but you missed what I said earlier. Republican pollsters have flooded the zone with a lot of heavy leaning rightwards polls, maybe in an effort to, some people are surmising, an effort to try to depress Democratic turnout. And so what we're seeing is when you're looking at Real Clear Politics, which has leaned heavily right in the past couple of cycles, and even going with 538, they're using their aggregate, which includes a majority of Republican polling firms. Even going with Real Clear or going with 538, that still is going to show a heavy Republican lean. And what I'm talking about, which we know that we can, that it is tried and true for many different election cycles, is early voter turnout, which goes towards Dems, and young voter registration, Gen Z voter registration. Young people are idealistic. They tend to vote Democratic.
If they
and
vote.
so that's what that's
If
more along
they,
the line of what I'm basing it on, because we're seeing so many Republican pollsters flood the zones. And I'd love to come back later on tonight or tomorrow to discuss this, to see who is right and who is wrong.
Okay, gentlemen, you are going to be with us for the rest of the hour, so you'll have a chance to tell us, give us more of your thoughts. But for now, let's get back to Sean.
Okay, Anna, thanks very much. Now we're going to move on to the state of Georgia, where two hotly contested races are playing out at the polls. You heard a bit about those. Voters are going to choose their next governor and senator. Turnout is said to be high in Georgia, with less than an hour to go before the polls close. Our Jim Spellman continues our team coverage. He is outside in Atlanta. Jim, let's begin with the governor's race, a rematch for the incumbent and Democratic challenger. Both of these folks have a certain degree of fame on the national landscape as well.
Yeah, that's right. Brian Kemp is the incumbent. He won the election 4 years ago. He's largely been running on the economy, arguing that under his leadership, Georgia was one of the first states to reopen its economy after COVID-19 lockdowns. He did things that are very popular here, like cut the gas tax when gas prices were high. He's facing up against Stacey Abrams, who has become essentially a national icon, as she's advocated in her campaign for things like abortion rights, more gun control, and her signature issue is voting rights. She's argued that voting rights make it difficult, especially for minorities, to get out to vote and get their votes counted. However, record early voting here. Laws have changed. There's now 2.5 weeks of early voting. You can use a drop box, you can mail in your ballot, or you can vote on Election Day. 2.5 million people already have voted here over the last 3 weeks or so. We expect that to be about half of the total number of people who vote. As you said, most polling places in Georgia, including this one, will close in less than an hour. Anyone who's still in line inside the building will be able to still vote. But we understand that the Secretary of State here is keeping 6 polling places open past 7 o'clock because they opened late this morning. That's 6 polling places out of 2,600. So election officials here feel that this is a pretty well-run election. All of that about the early voting and the way elections are run here have taken some of the urgency out of Stacey Abrams' arguments to a lot of voters here. Polls find her 6, 7, 8% behind Brian Kemp. Sean?
Okay, Jim, let's turn to the Senate race, because that is incredibly important as well, neck and neck. And here we have a former college football star in Georgia pitted against someone who now is at the pulpit where Martin Luther King Jr. preached for so many years.
Sean, how do we explain college football to an international audience? I don't know, but it is such a huge influencer here in the state of Georgia. A coach passed away just about a week and a half ago. Flags have been at half-staff throughout the state, and that coach appears in ads for Herschel Walker, who was a star football player here, won the top award for college football players, and was really a beloved figure in the state for those football accomplishments. Controversial figure. He's been open about his struggles with mental health. He's had a few things happen in this campaign where he's firmly against abortion. A couple of women have come forward and said they pressured them to have abortions. He's been a difficult candidate for the Republican Party. He is endorsed by Donald Trump, though, and that means a lot. His opponent, as you mentioned, Reverend Raphael Warnock, pastor at the church Ebenezer Baptist, where Martin Luther King Jr. was pastor. It's an incredible legacy. He won a special election 2 years ago. He's trying to win a full 6-year term now. It's really coming down in these final hours to character. Listen to a little bit of each candidate. Listen.
You look at the character flaws of the person that they put up, this is the difference between right and wrong. You cannot trust Herschel Walker to tell the truth about the basic facts of his life. You cannot trust him to be held accountable for his own actions.
And that's what we got to get people in Washington that say, if you don't like the United States, you can leave the United States of America. Because this is our country, and we have rules and laws here that we got to go by, because the guy I'm running against, he is trying to be that smooth talking, slick walking guy that he's trying to fool you and take you down in that elevator.
Warnock had been ahead for much of this race. Herschel Walker seems to have perhaps a 1-point lead, essentially neck and neck going into Election Day. Republicans hope that the more popular governor, Brian Kemp, will have some coattails that will help Herschel Walker. Democrats hope that it's the passion in their base for their issues that will drive more of their voters to the polls. But Sean, this may not be over tonight or tomorrow when these votes are cast. They have a rule here in Georgia: if neither of the candidates makes it to the 50% threshold, and there's a third-party libertarian candidate in the mix tonight, then there's going to be a runoff election. We might all be back here watching Georgia on December 6th if they have to move to a runoff. Sean?
Jim, you did a great job explaining college football and its importance in the South. Thanks very much.
In less than 2 hours, polls will close in Pennsylvania. The key swing state put President Biden over the top in 2020 and will help determine the fate of the U.S. Senate. The choice is between Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and Republican celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz. CGTN's Owen Fairclough is in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Owen, a lot at stake here. This is being described as one of those pivotal Senate races, these midterms. So what's at stake?
Arne and Sean, good evening from Bucks County. Just to add a little bit of fuel on the fire for the discussion you were refereeing a few moments ago between those gentlemen. One of the election officials who's polling outside this polling station you can see behind me thinks the turnout here is about 70% for this ward. This is Newtown in Pennsylvania. We're about an hour's drive north of Philadelphia, and the reason we came here is because this is the end of the campaign, certainly for the Mehmet Oz campaign. For viewers overseas, we might know him better as Dr. Oz, the protege of Oprah Winfrey, who shot to fame here in the US around 20 years ago, dispensing medical advice on her show. It's his first time taking a swing at politics and running for that vital Senate seat, Arnold, which, as you say, here in Pennsylvania could well determine who controls the Senate in Washington, D.C. He's going up against John Fetterman, who, just to add an even greater layer to this whole midterm fascinating narrative, had a stroke in the spring. He soldiered on, he's recovered somewhat, so you now have a recovering stroke victim going up against a TV star surgeon. Now, in some ways, their positions are fairly easily defined. John Fetterman is a very progressive Democratic lieutenant governor here in Pennsylvania who cut his political teeth as the mayor of a town. He tried to revitalize a former steel town here in Pennsylvania. Now, he claims that Mehmet Oz is simply a carpetbagger and a TV star looking to essentially buy a Senate seat. He only recently moved to Pennsylvania in the last year or so, and Fetterman claims he's simply out of touch with the needs of ordinary voters, particularly blue-collar voters, and these are the real swing voters in this state who've gone for candidates like Donald Trump in the past and then swung back to Joe Biden. But here in Bucks County, it gives you an idea just how swingy Pennsylvania is. Indeed, it went for Trump in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020. So you can understand why the candidates really want this particular seat as well. But as I say, as you mentioned, Arnold, polls are closing here at 8 p.m. One of the election officials was saying that the turnout, he thinks, is about 70% for this ward, which is on par with the presidential election. And from everything you've been talking about, that appears to be being repeated across the United States, a big, big turnout for these crucial midterms.
So, Owen, as we were saying earlier on, 35 Senate seats are being contested. But let's talk about the state where you are, Pennsylvania. Why does it matter so much?
Well, of course, it's always been a big swing state. We've seen it going back and forth, reliably Democrat for a long time, but went for Donald Trump famously in 2016. And then, of course, Joe Biden took it back in 2020. It's also fascinating for another, important for another reason, Arne, and that's the governor race. It's received much less coverage internationally, but it's seen as crucial. We have Doug Mastriano, a former U.S. Army colonel, going against the Attorney General for Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. Now, Mastriano, just like Mehmet Oz, is another Donald Trump-endorsed candidate, and he's been very willing to channel and indeed vocalize those discredited claims about the 2020 election. But the governor position here in Pennsylvania is extremely crucial for Republicans because it's a Commonwealth. The governor of Pennsylvania gets to appoint the Secretary of State in charge of elections. In many other U.S. states, indeed the majority of U.S. states, the Secretary of State is voted by electors. And the thinking among some Republican circles is that if Doug Mastriano does win that governor race and gets his hands on the election machinery, That would be a great gift for Donald Trump, who's channeling these ideas that the election was stolen from him and wants his Republicans, certainly as hardcore, to try and get hold of the election machinery itself. The polls there are much wider. At one point, Shapiro had a double-digit lead over Mastriano, though it's true to say that in recent weeks that has narrowed somewhat. But that governor race is being very closely watched by Donald Trump, who, as we understand it, is preparing to declare his own presidential candidacy for 2024 in maybe a week or so.
Thanks, Owen. That's CGTN's Owen Fairclough talking to us from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Well, we are just getting started here with our midterm election special. Up next, a look at the economic issues motivating voters.
All you need to know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Oh, I think it's a major issue. It's the big issue.
I mean, the other issues are important, but if the economy isn't running smoothly, I mean, you know, people start hurting, and it gets very hard for people to focus on any other issues.
For many voters, it's all about the economy in this midterm election. Inflation, gas prices, and interest rates, all key concerns.
Okay, let's bring in our global business anchor, Philip Yin, to evaluate some of these economic issues. And in many ways, Phil, the markets have already voted. They've been up the last 2 days, clearly showing that they expect both parties to control one of the houses. So no major changes in policy, which could keep things hopefully on a smooth ride for the future, right?
Yeah, the anxiety level over this cost of living, the direction of the economy, all major issues for both Democrats and Republicans. Consumer confidence right now is at its lowest level in nearly a decade. According to the Pew Research Center, the economy has consistently been the top issue for voters throughout the year. In October, their survey, roughly 8 in 10 adults said that economic conditions today are poor. People are obviously feeling it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, they're watching it on the news. The annual inflation rate right now stands at 8.2%. And in an aggressive effort to fight inflation and to prevent a recession, well, the Federal Reserve is keeping raising rates. They're still doing it. They just did another 3/4 of a point. That's the 4th time in a row this year. And in the last University of Michigan survey, when they asked which party they trusted more with the economy and which would be better for their personal finances, the overwhelming result was Republicans. For more on the impact of the economy in today's election, Ryan Patel, board member, Claremont Graduate University, Drucker School of Management. Good to see you again. And there's a lot here, but I want to focus a lot on those last 2 numbers that I just talked about. Consumer confidence, potential recession. How much of the economy is driving turnout this year?
Yeah, you know, you mentioned the economy, the economic conditions are always a conversation, but what makes it really different here, Phil, is that we are talking about gas prices, we're talking about food prices, we're talking about interest rates, we're talking about, there's a number that's going to affect almost every household, right, on a larger scale. And then obviously then you talk about jobs, you talk about cuts. You know, these all play a major factor, and there are other important factors in this voting cycle, but obviously the economic pressure when you're dealing with someone's bank account and money gets the most attention. And I think that's where you're going to see going into how it plays out, what policy going forward is. And the second piece, Phil, to this is also what's next. What does the outlook look like? There isn't a clear picture from any party because we're going to see more interest rates increasing and a recovery that's slower. And so that also causes more of a concern and a talking point because there isn't a clear answer, and it causes for a conversation for a lot of different parties to say, I've got the best plan.
Ryan, let me give you one more stat here. In the last survey from the University of Michigan, they talked to independent voters. These are people who don't identify as either Republican or Democrat, right? 34% think that the Republicans would be a better steward of the national economy. 33% versus 14% of independents believe on their personal finance they'd be better off. Why is it that they feel like Republicans would be better for their personal finances? What is it?
Yeah, it was great that you say that, because if you saw when Trump came into presidency, if you think about it, small business owners and the business community typically were the ones that were supporting or wanting less tax cut, have more money come in the pocket. The Republican Party has done that conservatively well and has a track record for doing that, and possibly less spending as well. And there's that ties to that, philosophy in that aspect. So, when you see that number and stat, it doesn't surprise me, because you're trying to cut in other places to get individually money in their pocket. But also, Phil, when you vote, it's an individual vote. So you pick a vote for what's best for you. And at that point, when you're voting, what matters to you the most? That's how that person typically is going to vote in general. So that's what makes this really interesting.
Yeah. The polls show that the Democrats will likely lose the House and will leave the Senate as a toss-up. But what Sean talked about earlier is that the market has begun to rally. They are anticipating perhaps a Republican victory, and they're rallying. What specific issue are they looking at that's giving them confidence that this is going to be actually good for the economy? Is it taxes? Is it our foreign policy? Is it our domestic policy? Is it the fight against inflation?
Phil, I got to be very honest with you. Are we really going to trust the market, how they're going to react out of all the news they go up and down going through this? I mean, if I had to guess in what they're looking at, is maybe some kind of change, but I don't think the market has really that clue to what it looks like short term and that change is happening. Even with the Republican Party control, it's going to take some time for them to put their policies in place. And we're going to face, Phil, the next meeting a 50 basis point increase, a 25 basis point increase from the Fed, an interest rate in January. So, and all the interest rates that are taking on a hike, you're going to start feeling over the next couple of months. So if the market thinks it's going to be a turnaround immediately because a change of leadership comes in, or if someone's reading that way, let me tell you right now, that's not the case. I think it's just looking for any kind of hope, and the market is looking for that.
Ryan Patel, thank you. Sean, there's your answer. Apparently the markets could be wrong.
Okay, we'll monitor that. An exciting night, a lot more to come, more on the issues that will determine the outcome of this election as our CGTN midterm special continues.
Introducing CGTN Now. Find award-winning documentaries and exclusive content from around the world. Latin America like you've never seen. Breakthrough films shining a light on important stories. In-depth discussions with fascinating people. Giving you new perspective on topics that matter. You also get live, round-the-clock international news and headlines, and so much more. Original content from CGTN's Global Bureau. Download the CGTN Now app and find the global perspective you've been missing. Available on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire. Or go to cgtnnow.com on your tablet or mobile device. CGTN Now. See the difference. Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business. We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.
They're coming after your right to vote and who get to count the vote. No, for real. You got 350 so election deniers on the ballot on the Republican ticket. No, this is really deadly earnest, man. Democracy is on the ballot this year.
President Joe Biden, they're addressing some issues that are of concern to a lot of voters. Since 2020, there's been a contingent of election deniers who believe the presidential election was stolen. And more than half of the Republican candidates running in this midterm election have doubts about or outright deny the results of the 2020 race. The Republican candidate in Arizona's governor's race is just one of those election deniers running for office. As our election coverage continues, Hendrik Saibrandi is in Phoenix for us. And Hendrik, great to see you. Let's talk Arizona. This is a state, of course, that used to be a Republican stronghold, but it's been turning Democrat in the Trump era. So what does it look like? And will this election in Arizona be something of a test for Trump appeal?
Well, Anand, it very well could be. The polls are scheduled to close here in just a couple of hours from now, 7 o'clock local time. Behind me here at the Maricopa County Election Department, they've got these ballot drop boxes, lots of cars pulling into the parking lot here where the voters are dropping off their ballots. And then a couple of blocks away, there's actually a same-day in-person voting, and those polls, as I said, will close at 7. This race, for the reasons you mentioned, are very much under the microscope. Two races, really. The first one you alluded to is the governor's race, where Republican Kari Lake is facing off against Democrat Katie Hobbs, who's the current Secretary of State. As you mentioned, Kari Lake is one of those election deniers. If she were to win this race, she would basically be leading and in charge of the 2024 elections, the way they play out here in Arizona. So obviously a very closely watched race. At the same time, the U.S. Senate race, Democrat Mark Kelly is trying to win his first full term. He's running against Republican Blake Masters. Masters, another so-called election denier. Both races are thought to be extremely close. Both parties, voters in both parties, are voting very differently this time. Democrats have tended to vote early, either through these drop boxes or mail-in voting. Disproportionately, Democrats are voting that way. Republicans, many more of them, have chosen to vote today. So we saw these pictures of long lines at various polling places. The Republicans, of course, are very concerned about election integrity, so they say, and they've questioned whether elections like this can be and are being run fairly. They've gone to the extent of even sending people into Arizona over the last few months with carrying weapons, carrying body armor, and even intimidating voters until last week a federal judge told them to stop it and basically put strict limits on them, even to the point of telling them they could not disseminate false information about elections. So in the meantime, while those ballot watchers have kind of pulled back a bit, the U.S. Justice Department has sent election monitors to 24 different states, including Arizona. They're on the ground here to make sure that this election goes smoothly. Today, things have gone smoothly for the most part. One problem, though, involved tabulators here in Maricopa County. Those tabulators process completed ballots. About 20% of those tabulators were out at one point. Apparently, they had run out of ink. The Maricopa County recorder apologized for that mistake. Apparently, all of those tabulators are back up and running, but that's the kind of thing that could cause some controversy, perhaps even, especially if this is as close of a race as everybody says they expect it to be. The counting here could go on for quite some time. It took 9 days back in 2020 for Arizona election officials to declare President Biden the winner of Arizona by only a margin of about 10,000 votes. So close races are expected up and down the ballot. This situation is no different, and it could be days, perhaps even into next week, before we know who won. If Democrats win some of these races, we can also expect a series of challenges to the election results. That could add another curveball, and so it's only time will tell how all of this is going to unfold. Anand, back to you.
Right, Hendrik, one quick question on that Senate race. Of course, Mark Kelly, the incumbent senator in Arizona, very well-known senator. He's a former pilot, a former astronaut, in fact. He was leading in the polls, but Blake Masters, the challenger, saw his fortunes turn, and he caught up to some extent with Mark Kelly. What's behind the surge for Blake Masters?
Well, I think a lot of people have been talking about a red wave in this election. It's just the natural way of things. The two parties are so close. America is so divided that maybe it was inevitable that Masters would begin to close the gap. Kelly may still have a slight advantage in some of the polls that I've seen. This is one of those races Democrats cannot lose. If Kelly were to lose this race, then Democratic control of the U.S. Senate almost certainly slips away. So this is something they have to have. They have to have this seat. Kelly, by the polls I saw, is up by about a point or two at the most. So the counting for this race could go not just well into the night, but in the days to come. We may not know the result of this particular race until later this week.
Thanks, Henrik. That's Henrik Sebrandi reporting from Phoenix, Arizona. Now, Wisconsin voters have just a couple of hours to make it to the polls. They're deciding on races for governor, U.S. Senate, and Congress. CGTN's Dan Williams joins us now live from Madison. Dan, what's on voters' minds there?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, just over 2 hours to go until the polls close here, and certainly it's certainly busy earlier on, and things have gone largely smoothly, but much quieter now, it has to be said, as workers finish out their day. We expect, though, it could be quite late until we actually get the results from here. Last time, 2020, the results came through from Milwaukee, which is the where a significant amount of voters are obviously based, and that came through at 3 o'clock in the morning, and obviously has significant sway as to the way that this midterm will likely pan out. Now, plenty up and down the ballot up for the vote here, not least on a governor level with Tony Evers, the incumbent Democrat governor. He's facing challenge from Tim Michels, the Republican. Now, that is going to have significance, but also on a local level as well. The Republicans only need, at a local level, 1 extra state Senate seat and 5 extra seats in the Assembly, and they essentially will then have a supermajority, which could mean that they could essentially overturn any of Governor Evers' his veto. Essentially, he's already vetoed some 100 bills over the time that he's been governor. So even if he were to win, then that will have significance as well if the Republicans can achieve that. But of course, a lot of focus here will be on that Senate race between the incumbent, the Republican, Ron Johnson, up against Mandela Barnes, the Democrat, looking to become the first black senator from Wisconsin. Now, that would, of course, be hugely significant, but Barnes had about a 7-point lead during the summer. Johnson's managed to overturn that. The latest poll has him leading by some 6 points. The Marquette poll had it at around a 2% lead for Johnson as well. Could those polls be wrong? Well, that will very much depend on how well the Democrats can get their key support base really to come out on force here in Madison, as well as in Milwaukee and other inner city areas. If that happens, then maybe those polls could be potentially wrong. Now, I've been speaking to some of the voters here about that potential, as well as the Reverend Greg Lewis, who's the founder and president of Souls to the Polls, which is a group that very much looks to mobilize the black vote in order to make sure that they have their say. This is what he had to say a little earlier.
If you don't vote, then we shouldn't hear you talking about what you think is wrong. If you don't vote, because that's your power. That's how you make your voice heard, by voting.
He's way different than Ron Johnson, right? And okay, that's fine, Republicans, Democrats, but Mandela, to me, just has more of a feel of representing more people, more of the Wisconsinites.
You're actually voting for someone who cares more about people in a sense, you know, than the actual dirtiness of the politics.
Dan, how significant is the African American vote?
Well, it has significance in the way that, according to Greg Lewis, the white vote, he says, is around a 50-50 split. So if you add in that voice then of the black vote, then that could be the difference between whether the Democrats or the Republicans win. And certainly for Mandela Barnes, if he were to break through that glass ceiling, then that will, of course, have great significance here for the state of Wisconsin. Of course, just over 2 years ago here in Wisconsin, we had the Kenosha riots following the shooting of Jacob Blake. In neighboring Minnesota, we had the death of George Floyd, and the protests against police brutality were very much highlighted here in Wisconsin. So having Mandela Barnes come in just over 2 years later as the first black senator, there'll be significance to that as well. But of course, Ron Johnson, as I say, he was trailing badly in the polls just a few months ago. He's seemingly managed to turn that around and is now favored to win this seat. He has significant support in the rural areas and the conservative suburbs of Milwaukee. And this very much is similar across to the country, but certainly here in Wisconsin, this is very much a different vision for the state, with Ron Johnson also suggesting that there should be a referendum on abortion law as well. So, as I say, very much a different vision as to the very future of the state. But of course, this will have ramifications at a national level as well.
Thanks, Dan. Dan Williams there in Madison, Wisconsin. Sean? Well,
We are just about an hour away from polls closing in Texas. The state's marquee race there is for governor. It is the incumbent, Republican Greg Abbott, against Democrat Beto O'Rourke. CGTN's Tony Waterman joins us now from Austin, of course, the capital of that wonderful state. Tony, voters, the Hispanic issues always on the agenda there, and what's going on at the border always big. What are we looking at, and how are those races shaping up down in Texas?
Well, Sean, I'm at one of the 160-plus voting locations here in Travis County, and just with about an hour left to go, we've seen the steady trickle of people coming in, probably coming from work or after they put dinner on the table to get their votes in. Things have been running relatively smoothly here in Austin and really across the state. There have been reports and videos of very long queues in certain places, especially in South Austin and in South Texas, where we have some very, very close races taking place. But as you mentioned, the big race everybody's looking at is the governor's race. You have Republican incumbent Greg Abbott vying for a record-breaking third term in office. He has really focused his campaign on the economy and on immigration. We have seen record numbers of border crossings in the fiscal year of 2022. So we're talking about 2.76 million border crossings. And that is where he's focused his attention. Of course, he's been busing these migrants up to more northern liberal cities like D.C. and New York for months now, costing Texas taxpayers $20 million so far. His Democratic challenger and very much the underdog in this race is Beto O'Rourke. He has been courting these young, independent voters on issues like abortion and gun restrictions. We had seen this race really narrow down over the summer, especially after the Uvalde school massacre, when we had 19 children and 2 teachers killed at the Robb Elementary School. And then just a month later, we had the Supreme Court decision come down overturning Roe v. Wade. We saw this governor's race narrow within 5 percentage points, but really in the last month or two here, this has broken wide open, and Governor Abbott now has, according to the latest poll, an 11-point advantage heading into the results coming out tonight. And voters, of course, this is a big state. They have a lot of different issues on their minds, but take a listen to some of the voters that we spoke to earlier.
I voted on women's rights, people who menstruate. I voted for trans individuals and their families who are under attack.
Inflation, the economy, prices are horrendous. I thought I was going to be able to retire this year, and I'm going to have to wait another year.
There's an entire party who's not supporting the democratic process and outwardly rejecting facts. People vote with their pocketbooks, and they're concerned with housing is a big issue, especially here in Austin. It's a big thing that people are voting on. For folks like myself in our 30s, owning a home seems impossible. So I can understand that a lot of folks don't care about those sort of large existential concerns.
Well, one of the places that there is a lot of attention is really in South Texas. This is a part of Texas which you know is a very red state traditionally, but this is a part of Texas that has actually been controlled by the Democrats for over a century. And now you have Democrats in the fight of their political lives to maintain their dominance in this part of Texas, particularly in the U.S. Congressional District number 28. You have Henry Cuellar. He's been in this post for 17 years. He's looking for a 10th term in office, and he is up against a Republican newcomer, Cassie Garcia. She is a former Ted Cruz staff member, and she has been heavily endorsed by the Republican Party. They put a lot of money behind her to try to flip this area. There are two other districts in South Texas where we could also see a Democrat lose their seat. And this is partially because of redistricting after the last census. The lines were redrawn, and that really created these new pockets of Republican power, secured their power and stronghold in the state, and also because of a growing Latino vote for the Republican Party. The Latino vote, the Hispanic vote in the United States, is the second largest, but also the fastest growing in America right now. And according to a recent Washington Post Ipsos poll, heading into the midterms, Dems had a 27 percentage point spread over Republicans, which sounds like a lot, but it's down significantly from the 40% advantage that they had back in 2016 and 2018. This is becoming an increasingly important voting bloc, not just here in the state of Texas, but also across the United States. We've seen the GOP spend millions of dollars to get their message out to Latino voters and also try to bring them over to their side. And in just an example of this, Governor Abbott, who is very likely to win the governor's race tonight, is having his victory party, if it is a victory party, right down there in McAllen, Texas, which is right at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Tony, thanks so much.
The economy is the main issue on the minds of Florida's voters, but as they go to the polls, another storm is bearing down on the state just 6 weeks after a devastating blow from Hurricane Ian. Nitza Soledad Perez is in Miami. Nitza, great to see you. What are the main contests you're watching?
Well, at play in Florida is the governorship, 1 Senate seat, 28 House seats, and several state legislature and cabinet positions. Now, incumbent Governor Ron DeSantis is ahead of his opponent by 12 percentage points. Senator Marco Rubio is expected to win his 3rd term in Congress. He's ahead of Paul Demings by 10 points. Early voting turnout and vote by mail definitely is favoring the Republicans. The numbers that we have is 2.12 million Republicans versus 1.8 Democrats. Now, as for the House, Republicans right now ahead of the elections are holding 16 seats. The Democrats have 11 seats. They're being represented by 11 districts. And according to the latest polls, that numbers are expected to remain the same. Now, Florida did gain 1 seat in the House because of population growth. Now, many of you, especially Sean, that it's there in the anchor seat, has covered Florida. This used to be the toss-up state, that exciting state where everybody had to be on election night. That has changed. The Sunshine State has turned steadily Republican. The biggest surprise that we can expect tonight is that Miami-Dade County, where I'm located, the most populous county of Florida, heavily Democrat, also turns Republican. And if that happens, then the possibility of Republicans sweeping Congress is much higher. Anand?
Thanks, Nitza. That's CGTN's Nitza Soledad Perez talking to us from Miami.
Okay, we're going to bring back in our panelists. I'm sure they've been eager to get their time in for their final thoughts, both Douglas Sloan and Adolfo Franco. And Adolfo, I think you had a great idea. We need to bring you guys back in a couple of days and let's rehash all this because I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Douglas, I want to start with you, though. If 2020 is characterized by the big lie, could this year be the big deny? We heard what Biden said, and we know that so many GOP candidates have said, I don't know if I'm going to concede. What is going to be the legacy of what plays out today?
Well, it could really be a disaster if what I am predicting is true and the Democrats hold the Senate and do better than expected in the House and manage to win a few governorships in Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. and are able to make don't take a shellacking, which is normally what happens during these midterm elections when you have a Democratic president in power, then there are going to be a lot of Republicans that step forward and claim fraud. They've already have said that they're not willing to accept the lawful results of a free and fair election. That's really a problem that we're seeing within the Republican Party. And, we don't have any Democrats anywhere in our party that are saying that they are going to refuse to accept the results of an election. So we're really looking at a change in our political landscape here, and it really can pose a threat to our very democracy if we cannot have a peaceful transfer of power after our fair and free elections. So I'm hoping that this won't be the case, but if history, recent history at least, serves of any guide of what Donald Trump was saying in 2020, claiming that the election was a fraud, we really may be in for a long night and a long week and a long rest of the year here.
We think on it. Adolfo, would you like to respond to that?
Oh, yes. A couple of things I'd say. Of course, my friend Douglas, you don't have to worry because there's going to be a shellacking. But you're going to see a big spin by the Democrats on suppression and all these made-up lies, actually. But I want to set the record straight here on this program that I've been doing it for some time. My friend just said there's not a Democrat who denies an election. Stacey Abrams, did she deny the results in 2018? She was the certified loser. Governor Kemp is the governor. She never conceded and she denied it. She said the election was a fraud and was stolen from her. That's an election denier. Hillary Clinton said the election was stolen from her. That's an election denier. Congressman Raskin, who was one of the impeachment managers, put in articles of impeachment on the first day Donald Trump was sworn in, saying the election was stolen. Nancy Pelosi voted against George W. Bush certified election in 2004, and so did Mr. Nadler. So this nonsense that I keep hearing about election deniers, when they lose, they then say there's a question, and that's not denying the election. There's nothing wrong with questioning results. That's not denying an election. But to your point tonight, you don't have to worry about that, because this is going to be a resounding Republican victory. Their Democratic Party will not hold the House of Representatives, and the Democratic Party will likely lose the Senate and at best remain tied, but in all likelihood, a 1 to 2 seat Republican pickup.
Gentlemen,
so this nonsense, here's the facts for our viewers. Yeah. The denier is President Biden. He denies inflation, he denies there's an immigration crisis, and he denies, you had excellent reporting, by the way, which I never compliment the media on. I have to compliment you tonight.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm sorry, we have only about 8 seconds. Really, we got to have you back on in the future. This isn't going away. Thanks so much for your insight.
Thanks for joining us on this CGTN Elections special. Our coverage continues.